Welcome to the first ever episode of the Berlin Party with Neil
The
and
Berlin
Elias.
Afterparty. You already messed up the name.
We think this podcast and this dialogue could be really important to share parts of history that many people don't know. And so today we're just going to jump right into it. Elias, do you have anything to say before that?
This is our first time. We definitely don't have a first recording that I accidentally did not have access to and was thus deleted into the void of Twitch for us not to be able
Yeah.
to upload. So this is definitely not our second recording of this podcast. I think we can just jump right into it. Today we're talking about Japanese imperialism. So for context, this whole podcast, the Berlin Afterparty, is all about global imperialism, different facets. And we thought it would be interesting to talk about a lesser known topic, something that most probably Americans, like we're Americans, most of us don't talk about or learn about extensively. Cool. So Neil, do you want to kick it off?
Nice. Yeah, I would actually love to. So something really important to understand before you understand Japanese imperialism is what was happening in the world at the same exact time, right? So if you look at Elias, I think it's 1882. I don't remember the date, but in the Berlin Conference is when Europe, like European countries often do, right? They decided, oh, we're going to split up Africa, and this is how we're going to do it. And so when Europe started aggressively expanding and they decided like imperialism is the economic facet that we're going to progress and that's what we're going to do, it created ripples all across the world, right? It created ripples in America, it created ripples in Asia, and it affected Japan a lot because Japan saw these European countries expanding and they said, we need to do that out of so that like fear of missing out, FOMO, like we don't want to miss out on this economic opportunity, and then B, out of safety, because they believed if European powers continued expanding, Japanese sovereignty itself could be at risk. And so that led to a huge chain of events. Elias, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, like to be very specific. So, in 1839 was the beginning of the Opium War, the first Opium War in China with the British, and you just see this idea, even later on, called gunboat diplomacy, where the British, they just show up with these huge gunboats, these warships, and they say, open up your ports or else, right? So the irony, of course, in the word gunboat diplomacy, but Japan, obviously a nearby country, is seeing this and saying, it's either eat or be eaten. It's a dog eat dog world. So that's kind of the beginning of them ramping up, and you even see in this time frame from 1875 to 1913, Japan went from producing 0.6 million metric tons so we see in 1875 Japan is producing zero point 0.6 million of metric tons of coal annually, and in 1913, which is not a very long time later, it goes all the way up to 21.3 million metric tons. Same thing, they go from 26 steamships in 1873 to 1,500, more than that, only a couple decades later. And they have 18 miles of track in 1872, and again, only a couple decades later, they have 7,100. So it's just a huge, rapid industrialization and ramping up for their ongoing imperialism that we'll see soon.
Back to Japan, right? Remember previously we talked about all these ripple effects of West Europe's expansion, right? England, Germany, France, right? We see all these countries expanding, and there are effects to that. And so the first ripple effect you actually see and a convergence point happens between Russia and Japan. Now, not many people know that Russia and Japan actually fought a couple wars, the Russo-Sino Wars. Elias, I'm pronouncing that right. It's Sino, right?
I think it's Sino. Who cares?
Sino, okay. The Russo-Sino War, right? And so there's actually a couple of them. But the conflicts start in about 1894 to 1895, and then you get prolonged fighting all the way up to basically 1904, 1905. And these fights, interestingly, started because both Russia and Japan wanted to expand and become imperialist powers. And so they converged onto actually Korea and China. But before either of them could call basically dibs and go into these countries, they had to deal with each other first. And so you get these series of conflicts. And so this is, again, a huge oversimplification of a lot of serious events. We could teach entire courses. But basically, Japan comes out on top, and they actually beat Russia in the battle of naval powers. That's really huge. because when Japan actually beats Russia, they can finally go and continue their dream of becoming an imperialist power just like Western Europe. Elias, do you want anything to add or no?
No, you pretty much covered it, but yeah,
All right.
this is also
Yeah.
when like sorry, I said it, you pretty much covered it, and I just want to add one thing. This is kind of
No,
the
no, you're good.
stage.
You're good.
Sorry, this is kind of the stage where Japan is like becomes a player, right? Because they're like, wow, we just beat this enormous developing power. You know, we can
Yeah.
expand our influence to neighboring countries.
Yeah. And so, again, in 1910, that's when Japan finally, after they recover from some of the losses of the 1904 1905 war, they finally collect themselves, their resources, and they annex Korea officially. Now, that's the start of a really big, essentially, it's a turning converging point for Japan. Now, when Japan actually goes into Korea and they take over the area, for the first 10, 15 years, Japan is incredibly strict and they continue with a cultural, basically genocide against Korea. Now, let's like do a deep dive into the philosophies of Japan really quick, right? It's not going to be that deep. It's going to be shallow, maybe kiddie pool, right? Uh, Basically, when you look at Japan at the time, there's this philosophy going around about Pan-Asianism. And that idea sounds really good, right? Like one united Asian front where Asian countries can, be one. But in reality, there's some really like sinister beliefs behind that. And that's the belief that that's basically the belief that like Japanese superiority and that everything should be Japan. And so when Japan goes into Korea, for the first 10 years, you see Japan do a systematic erasure of Korean culture. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of historical artifacts removed and destroyed. You're talking temples and worship sites for Koreans being removed and replaced with all these Japanese praying Shinto sites. If you actually go to Korea today, you actually still see these Shinto praying temples, and you'll notice the fact that they're all made in like 1912 to 1915. You also see in schools, the Korean language itself is banned, and Korean last names are banned and replaced with Japanese names, right? This is a huge systematic erasure of Korean culture. And this happens basically all the way up until Japan loses all their colonial territories in 1945. Now, that's just scratching the surface of some of the atrocities Japan commits, along with just like the brutality and kind of racism that happens there, right? You also see some like really horrible practice that happens to the female population in Korea. Now, this happens also in Manchuria as well. Elias will probably talk about it too. But the use of comfort women, which is basically taking Korean women and using them as prostitutes, was a huge practice done by the Japanese, in Korea especially. Some estimates, according to Britannica, find that anywhere from the lowest number of 20,000 to 200,000 Korean women were taken and basically exploited and forced into the system of comfort women. And now when women were pushed into these roles, right, it brought like huge shame, obviously, and B, it was literally rape. And rape of like 200,000 people is a huge deal. And it's something that not many historians or not many people still talk about. And even today, we'll get to the modern aspect and modern reactions to Japanese imperialism later. But even today, right, the fact that these events aren't talked about as much is really bad. Or I can come up with a better word. It's honestly atrocious and a little and disgusting. And the fact that we don't learn about this and teach this in school. Now, Elias is going to talk about Japanese imperialism in Manchuria. Elias?
Yeah, so it's unfortunately a similar story in brutality. So when the Japanese went into Manchuria, I'm going to specifically be talking about this infamous unit. You may have heard of them. If you look them up, it's very gruesome. Viewer discretion advised. They're called Unit 731. And what Unit 731 is tasked with in Manchuria is biological warfare testing. So essentially, their job is to test all of these new ideas on biological warfare, which is a very new thing in the early 20th century, on essentially prisoners, civilians, literally anybody that they can get their hands on. They would even like fly over Chinese cities and just infect them with various different pathogens and see what would happen. So it was really just an all-out attack on innocent people for the most part. what they would do is they would, let's say they shoot down a plane one day that's flying overhead, an allied plane. They would then take the people, and instead of killing them or putting them in prison, they would send them to Japanese universities, and they would be tested on live. So there are stories of people being amputated and then having their guts arranged. And keep in mind, this is without anesthesia, for these medical students to test, essentially to test the medical students, right? For them to try out all these techniques, but without any anesthesia, and they're just forced upon these people. And it gets a lot more gruesome than that. There's stories about how essentially they would just torture civilians and prisoners to see how much the human body could bear. That way Japan could find out how much their army could bear as well, right? Because they're humans. So they would, let's say, put people out into the freezing cold, right? Because Manchuria is in the northern part, the northeast of China. It's right up next to Russia. It's only a small distance from North Korea. There's a railroad that goes right there. When I visited, there's a railroad that goes straight into North Korea. So it's all the way up north, and essentially they would just put people out in the cold, and then maybe even splash water on them, and wait until they got frostbite, and then they would bring them back inside, see what would happen, see how the body reacts. They would do all of these tests on people, for essentially just to see what the human body could bear, how the human body would react to different elements. Where it gets especially gruesome is the death toll that historians estimate, is around 200,000 to 850,000. But they actually think that it could be way more. And the reason for this is essentially Unit 731 officers would often rape female prisoners. And then their children would be also tested on. But those children were never accounted for in our death tolls because, well, how would we know how many children were born in these camps? So it could be way more than 500,000. We have no idea. But it's just especially gruesome. And finally, I mean, there's a lot more. I took a lot out.
And Elias, yeah, I was actually about to say, like, that's scratching the surface. So we hinted at it before. We actually did a recording of this episode before, and to no fault of anyone here, right? The recording didn't get saved. But I actually did some research on this, event, because I was like curious, right? And when I realized how many gruesome, meaning it's real, like if you don't have a strong stomach, do not look this up, because I was aghast. I mean, Elias, I can't imagine how like traumatic. I'm 17 for those of you out there, and I've seen some like pretty bad stuff. And even my stomach like churned when I heard some of this. Like, go to the Wikipedia. I don't know how reliable it is, but some of the stuff they have on there, if it is true, and I'm assuming it is crazy.
Yeah. And the pictures they have. And actually, we'll get back to the purposeful existence of these pictures. We'll get back to that later, because it's actually a very important aspect of the brutality that went on here, that it's so well documented, even though nobody survived. But we'll get back to that later. But just to top off this discussion, as much as I censored a lot of this, I actually went to Manchuria once, and I went to this place called Harbin, and there's this museum there. And I've talked to Neil about this, and essentially it's this black marble museum. So, there's black marble, and you immediately get this kind of sinister undertone. You're like, there's something going on here. Why is this place just fully black? It looks mysterious. So you go in, and it's actually a museum of all the documentation of Japanese war crimes in Manchuria. You walk through, and the part where I lost it, this was maybe halfway through, there's just videos that the Japanese took documenting how they would fly a plane over this. So there's this pregnant woman, right? Because they would actually test on different types of people, including pregnant women. And we assume it's essentially inferred that she was raped in these camps. And this pregnant woman, she has, I believe it was anthrax or something dropped on her. And you see, as the dust clears, you see her body, and it's just absolutely ravaged. It's disgusting. And I just lost it. I just started crying. It's so brutal. And that's the entire museum. It's so well documented. And when I said I was going to go back to it, this is an important discussion for us to have. Because when you look at it, these people were not ashamed. They were not trying to hide anything. They were doing this for an explicit reason. And that was the idea that they had to research these things so that they could use it in warfare. So the extent of it wasn't just to test on people, but it was specifically to improve their own biological weapon manufacturing, and then use it in war. So you can even imagine that if the Japanese had not lost with the Axis powers in World War II, how bad of a state they would have absolutely ravaged the rest of neighboring countries, even more so than they already
100%.
did, as we're talking about.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is my research on Japanese war crimes in Manchuria.
Yeah. And it's important that we look at this holistically, because I mean, I'm a big believer in historical retribution, and that you should tell these stories, even if it does make us uncomfortable, even if it was in the past. And even the argument that it was in the past, right? Although ironic in a history podcast, is not a great reason, because 1945, like, that is incredibly recent. There are still comfort women who are alive today, to this day, and they still haven't received any sincere apology from the Japanese government. And I said I'd come back to this, and it is still an area of basically hot debate, and it's a very sensitive topic. But I believe, Elias, I actually have a question, since you've done a lot of research on Unit 731. Was there any justice or any tribunal testimonials? I know after World War II, we saw, of course, the many Nazis were put on trial. Were any of these experimenters, these horrible people, really put on trial?
It's actually very interesting, and we didn't even talk about this the first recording of this, so I'm semi glad that I lost all the footage. My apologies.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry about that. But
okay,
it's interesting. Essentially, what happened was in Germany. Part of the reason why nowadays Germany has such strict laws against denying the Holocaust, all of these things, is because they were actually punished for these things. The large SS officers, different people that were behind the Holocaust, were tried. Part of that was also because there were survivors of the huge concentration camps that they had all across Europe. In Japan, or in Manchuria, there were no survivors. So it was very hard to track down the perpetrators. The second part that made it extremely hard to track down the perpetrators is that before the Americans got to them, the Japanese scientists very cunningly and quite maliciously got together and essentially made a game plan about how they were going to deny everything that happened. So part of what added on to that actually was that the Americans' translator, when they were investigating, their translator was actually part of Unit 731. So he was purposely, during the interrogations, manipulating the translations between, I guess, prisoners and the Americans. So it was making it very hard to track down. But here is the truly, truly sad part. By the time the Americans realized that Unit 731 had gone down, and that all of these war crimes, all these terrible, terrible things had gone down, the Americans took it as an advantage, right? Because after World War II, we of course see the proxy wars that happened between the United States and the Soviets. Now, we already knew that this was going to happen by the end of World War II. We knew that there were going to be these two huge powers. So what did the Americans do? They actually struck a deal with these terrible, terrible war criminals. And they said, we want all of your biological warfare findings. We want all of your research. We want all of these new innovations that you've made in the destruction of human beings. You have to understand that most of these weapons that were created, that were tested on, are illegal. If you use them, the UN, well, they don't actually have any power, but if they did, they would go after you, right? Hypothetically.
Yeah.
These are extremely, extremely harmful substances. And instead of persecuting the perpetrators and fixing the situation that they created, I say we because me and you are both Americans, but the American government at the time struck a deal with them to just get all the information and let them run free. So when you say that there were comfort women that are still alive today, there are Unit 731 officers that are still alive today that were actually, they were interviewed by, I believe, the New York Times, I think the Washington Post. You can see these interviews. You can see that these people were never persecuted.
Yeah.
And that's terrible.
And what I think is, what really struck out to me in that story is the translator bit, because a large part it does feel like they're getting away with it. And like imagine after World War II that Himmler, I think that's how you pronounce it, wasn't he the major? He was Adolf Hitler's right hand man. Imagine he was in charge of the translation in that trial, right? Meaning it is so corrupt, and it's really disheartening. And again, this is why we're talking about it, because these people may have gotten off the hook, right? But we can never let these stories be truly lost. And I think it also brings up another fact that immediately after, uh, even after World War II, right, and these people, like, these events ended, right, you see a continuation of these war crime level events. I mean, in the Korean War, I was going to talk about the Korean War a little bit. Basically, right after World War II, Japan lost and they gave up all their land in Korea. America immediately replaced them. And it's not even an understatement to say America and Russia literally had a scramble for Japan's land. And if you don't know this, in the 1950s, there was the Korean War, and 3.4 million Koreans died in that war, right? Only 50,000 American soldiers died in that war. So it's important to note that the causes and effects of imperialism run incredibly deep. And even to this day, if you look at North Korea, right, 74%, I remember reading the statistic and it was mind-blowing, 74% of their population is suffering through extreme malnutrition. Malnutrition-induced blindness is the highest in North Korea than any other country in the world. And it is really no understatement to say that the even invent of a military state like North Korea, and the reason why it's a military state is because for North Korea, right, after the Korean War, they settled at the 34th parallel, North and South Korea, the US and Soviet sides, and they basically said, we're going to pause, right, and we're going to do our own things. North Korea still thinks this war is going on. They are expanding and they are a military power because of this war and because of the actions of America and Russia and the imperialist actions. So it is really no understatement to say, and I think Elias will agree with me here, that the malnutrition and the absolute atrocities that are happening in North Korea and the absolute atrocities that happened during the Korean War are because of imperialism and because of the actions of US, Russia, and honestly Japan as well.
Yeah, 100%. And to add on to the Soviet American, I guess, proxy wars that happened following World War II, it's actually interesting because I think in American schools we're kind of taught that the Soviets were the bad guys, and they were no better. They were definitely not the good guys, but I would say neither were the Americans. And to add on to that, actually, the Soviets obtained 12 Japanese Unit 731 members. So when we got the Unit 731 members, the American government chose to conceal their war crimes in order to obtain knowledge about biological warfare. Now, in the American narrative, we would assume, I bet the Soviets did worse. Well, actually, they persecuted all 12 of them, and they did not conceal their war crimes. So we knew that this was happening, and we called it communist propaganda, right? We said, oh, the Japanese didn't do all that. That's just the Soviets saying that. Are you a communist? Would you believe that? Right? But in reality, Soviets were correct. The Japanese had done these things. And this is not to make the Soviets sound like amazing people, right? But it is to highlight the fact that sometimes our preconceived notions on the Cold War are entirely false, where you have the Soviets who are, in this case, doing justice to the war crimes that happened, while the Americans are literally covering up war crimes in order to get material. And what was the thing? So one last interesting concept before we, I guess, review or like talk about some of the implications is that historians note how the Germans during this period had three main motives. Historians actually know that the Germans had these three main motives. One of them was nationalism. The second one was actually the idea of like racial superiority. And the third one, above the Roma and the Jews and all the different groups that they attacked. And the third was actually this idea of racial contamination, which is brought on, of course, by the idea of racial superiority, where if you have these other groups involved, well, they're going to taint the like Aryan blood. Obviously, this is all in quotes. The historians actually note that the Japanese exhibited two of these motivations. They actually did not have this idea of like race mixing being bad. They were not fearing for the Japanese blood being tainted or racial purity. But they did want to eliminate inferior populations, and they wanted to occupy their new territories for Japanese imperialist expansion, which kind of relates to the idea of Lebensraum, which I'm definitely mispronouncing.
And you could even say, not to interrupt you, I apologize, but you could even say that the racial mixing or the infection aspect of it, you could even argue that Japan or Japanese imperialists during like this early 1900s did believe in it, but in a sense that they wanted to erase Korean culture altogether and make them into Japanese. So it isn't more contaminate. I don't know if contamination is technically right, because I don't think they believed in that. I just think they did not want anything to do with Korean culture and mixing with theirs. So I think technically it does.
Just basically what you just said. It's actually interesting because the reason that the third one doesn't necessarily fit, which is the racial purity standpoint, it could be because of their history. Germany obviously had Jews and Poles either in the country or at the border, right, and in surrounding places. Yeah. So, for example, Germans who were married to Poles were actually completely and like utterly, I guess, disenfranchised from society.
Or ostracized.
Ostracized, that's the word. They were completely ostracized from society and humiliated in public. On the other hand, Japan was extremely isolationist in its past, being an island and being isolationist. So it's possible that the reason they didn't have this idea of racial impurity yet is because they hadn't actually mixed as much with other places. Hypothetically, obviously, racial purity doesn't exist, but if it did, right, they were not necessarily in other places before that, since they were isolationist. So they didn't develop this racist idea because they hadn't been exposed to it yet. So it's possible that further on, it could have easily been like that. And as you said in Korea, right, it's a very interesting connection to make because their motivations are extremely similar, even though Germany and Japan are as far as like two countries can be on the globe, right?
Yeah, and it's not like we're in the age of like internet, you know what I mean? Especially in the early 1900s, where you could go on Reddit and be like, oh, how to become an imperialist nation that commits war crimes, right? There is no subreddit for that, interestingly.
Yeah.
But the fact, yes, please don't create that subreddit. But but the fact that these two countries, first of all, banded together in World War II and had the same exact ideologies is really no surprise, considering that their actions and executions of their atrocities were so similarly placed. So, Elias, great point. If you want to continue, please do.
That is all for like my research and everything. Do you want to?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, mostly for my research part is over. There's some small details, but like other than that, we can just get into some like conversations about it. I start again. Cool. So the context here is really like simple, right? Basically, an American commentator said something along the lines of Japan going into Korea was super duper helpful, and Koreans should be grateful because they brought all this technology and random stuff. And a lot of Koreans were insulted by this. And so it brings up a really compelling point that it is, and it pains me a little bit to say this, right? Actually, I should be delicate when saying this. It is true that when Japan went into Korea, they did place a lot more infrastructure, and here's a fact: during that time, during Japanese imperialism, right, whereas Japan was the number one manufacturing power in the region, Korea was second, and Korea's economic success after Japanese imperialism was definitely related to the groundwork that Japan set up. And it's very fascinating to think about, that connection. But a lot of the infrastructure and manufacturing set up was very much, it wasn't done benevolently. It was done, and I think Elias in our last recording brought this up, and it was a very smart point. It was that in like India, right, when England went into India, as you guys know, or maybe that's a whole other episode. Maybe that's next episode, right? But when England went into India or went into any of these countries, they did put down a lot of infrastructure, but they also A, mess up the environment, another conversation, but B, the reason why they put down the infrastructure was so that they could be more efficient in their resource exploitation, right? And it is really like when Japan went in to Korea and probably to China, their main goal was resource exploitation and sovereign security. They wanted to make sure that their island was safe and had enough money to secure itself from European powers. And so it really brings up an interesting point to see that there are, you know, effects to imperialism that are not all, you know, genocide, war crime, you know, cultural erasure. But Elias, I think you want to jump in. I see you plotting something.
No, it's definitely an interesting thing, and we actually see this parallel all over the place. You mentioned India. There's actually a conversation right now about how essentially history revisionists talk about how you know, European rule after the Berlin Conference was you know, it was wonderful. You know, they laid down so much track, right? Because you have the track from Cairo to South Africa, or we might have to put like a thing up here in the corner.
We're gonna have a lot of edits,
like an asterisk that says like whatever. The point being, the point being, in my personal opinion, and I think most people from developing countries that were imperialized would agree, is that you can learn something from another society without them dominating your society and effectively destroying it, right?
Yeah, preach.
So, like you said, in India, they put down tons of railroads, right? But it wasn't because they wanted Indians to be able to ride trains. It was because they wanted to move resources all over the place and be able to export it back to the motherland. So I think it's a very interesting conversation about how when we look at history, we have to be extremely wary of revisionists who try to tell us that, oh, no, this guy who killed so many people, this army that did all these things, well, it's fine because they did good things in the long run.
Yeah.
But there's no price on the lives. So I'll let you talk in 1 second. But there's really no price. There's no price on the lives that were taken and the society that was destroyed, right? Because even though these developing countries did get infrastructure, for example, many African countries got infrastructure, they also were set back to the Stone Age, right? There were so many genocides. So it wouldn't be fair for us to equate infrastructure to lives.
100%. And even if you look at Africa specifically, the boundaries and these arbitrary boundaries set up, honestly, not even in Africa. Let's look at like a big theme of imperialists leaving is that when they split up these borders, it creates more harm than if they would just have left. Like look at Africa, look at India, right? The separation of like India and Pakistan and this like ethnic border that was created probably caused, not probably, 100% caused more conflicts than if Britain just left and let sovereign powers deal with it. Look at Africa.
You know this better than I do, but the partition in India and Pakistan literally costed millions of lives. Like it's we know this as a fact.
We know this. We're trying to save something for next episode, though. Come on.
Sorry. It took a mysterious run of lives. Find out on the next episode. Find out on
the next episode, exactly. And if you look at Africa, if you track terrorism and areas of high amounts of violence and corruption, you can see just a clear track of imperialist nations leaving their mark there. And then another point that I really wanted to mention is that a lot of revisionists, try to paint it in a good light. But even if you accept this framework or this idea that, there was economic success, at what cost? And so a big theme and some things that people are realizing more and more with global warming and climate change is that the effects of the Industrial Revolution are coming to bite us in the butt with a passion. And if you look at, let's look at Korea, for example. When Japan went in there, they cut down, and I can even I'll find the exact number. Look at Korea and Japan's influence, right? When Korea went in there, when Japan went to Korea, they cut down millions and millions of acres, right? Or millions of trees down, right? Tens of thousands of acres of trees and replaced it with their own Japanese species. One, because of this it's really sick, honestly. They wanted to do it to make Korea more like Japan, Japan was very obsessed with making Korea exactly like, just basically an extension of Japan. And then two, right, for resource exploitation, obviously. But the effects of that are coming back to bite them, as these species, obviously aren't meant to be there. And then if you go back to India, right, if you look at India today, England's mark and their absolute resource exploitation and how they basically cut down and expanded the agriculture industry in some really harmful ways. They destroyed all these forests. They destroyed all these like really nice, really helpful ecological zones, right? Is now biting. It's seriously coming back because now floods are many times worse because of basically small term like climate change, right? Obviously, no, I'm not going to go into a huge science lesson here, right? But then two, if you look at on net, the impacts of the Industrial Revolution, which obviously created a cyclical, imperialist dog chase tail kind of relationship, right? Is now creating a very detrimental impact to our society in the form of climate change.
100%.
And so even if you want to be very geeky and be like, well, technically, right, and then want to look at the economy, right? If you look by 2050, right, we're going to see a rise of the oceans, right? We're going to see an increase of natural disasters, and we're going to see trillions of dollars of infrastructure thrown down the drain because of this. So on net, even if you want to look at it with this very positive, Elias, if you want to look at this optimistic, positive view, right, even then, you still have to admit that imperialism gets a thumbs down, unlike this video.
Which is a thumbs up. All right, yeah. Thank you. What are we running at right now? We're running at like 40 minutes. This is my final note, and then you can have yours. Mm-hmm. I think it's important to connect this back to things that we know. So this is extremely similar, whether we like it or not, unfortunately. This is extremely similar to the American or the colonist wiping out of the Native American culture and the Native American land. For example, the same way that this is actually kind of a pattern. Ecological practices in indigenous areas all across the world are generally sustainable. Why? Because these people have been living there for thousands and thousands of years, so they know how to keep their land. Right. So let's say for Native American Indians, they actually had crop rotation, and they would, let's say, leave crops off for this, like they'd leave this field empty for a year, or they'd plant a certain different crop. When the Americans got there, or technically not Americans, when the colonists got there, the Anglo, when the Europeans got there, and they decided that we will make so much money off of tobacco and later cotton, well, now you're only farming one thing, and you are taking, and again, not to be a history lesson, you're taking all the nitrogen and all the proteins out of that soil. Well, that soil is going to have massive soil degradation over even just the next couple of decades. Forget about centuries. So later on in American history, you see what is it called? The Dust Bowl? The Dust Bowl, yes. Actually, yeah. If you guys ever read... That is a direct effect of imperialism. That is a direct effect of colonization. Because why didn't they have Dust Bowls every 2 generations back when indigenous people ruled that land? Because they knew how to keep that land. But when you have people come in that are looking for profit, and they're not looking to sustainably keep that land, and by extension, the people that live on that land, you actually see long-term economic issues to ignore the, of course, humanitarian issues that you get with killing people. I mean, they go hand in hand. And to just continue, right, in stride of what you said, let's look at a very modern example. The forest fires that happened in California, the indigenous tribes that lived in California had annual burning cycles, where they would burn foliage, right, and had controlled burns, essentially, right? When these essentially Europeans, right, these white colonizers would come in, they forced indigenous tribes to stop that, right? And because of that, you're seeing the effects. And even today in natural lands, right, because you see this huge decrease in indigenous populations, right, you're seeing a direct effect, right? You're seeing huge forest fires, which are causing obviously like visible, wow, the whole state of California seems to be burning alive. If that's not a clear enough sign, then you know what I mean? What else can we say? So it's a fantastic point. Should I say my final words and then we'll call it? Final remarks and we'll be done. No, my final remarks is we went all across the world today in this podcast. We went from Japan to California, which is pretty close actually, not really that far, but
the main point and the takeaway that you as a viewer should understand, and we're not telling you this because we have anything against Japan. We're not telling you this because we have anything against, well, actually, I have a little bit against some American policies. As an American, that's my right. But we're telling you this because oftentimes in history, it's easy to treat it as a series of boring dates, disconnected, that I need to memorize and then forget about. It's one of those classes where, oh, I'm never going to need this in my life. In reality, history is arguably one of the most important classes, because if you can't understand and see these patterns arise before it becomes a genocide, before it becomes a world war, right? You have to be able to recognize them. And so one of the clearest examples, right, of like racial superiority, there's a reason why we treat this as an AS level threat, right? Because we've seen how truly dangerous it can be. And we're in the middle of a pandemic right now. Elias and I would be in the same room right now if we didn't have a pandemic, right? Let's look at this in terms of pandemic terms. It's easier to stop a pandemic when it's one person and have them quarantine, right, than have like hundreds of thousands of people, right? Clearly. And so you got to think of it like that. Every day you need to understand how you ended up here, why the world is like it is, and learn and grow from that, which is why we do this podcast and why I really like doing it. So yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good thesis, that history is an important subject, because we have to think of, I mean, everything is connected back, right? We're connecting back to the modern day, but the fact of it is that it's all a timeline. These aren't like separated. It wasn't World War II and then the Cold War and then we lived it, blah blah blah. It's all one and the same. I think it's a good way to end it off, Neil. Good job.
It's like a thick Rube Goldberg machine. You know what I'm talking about?
Dude, it's an M. Night Shyamalan twist.
Yeah, but dude, M. Night Shyamalan movies are not as well written as history. Let me tell you that.
You want to know something? The M. Night Shyamalan twist of history is that imperialism. I know. Cut. The M. Night Shyamalan.
No, continue. I thought it was gonna be funny. Just give me the blooper reel.
The M. Night Shyamalan.
You know what this feels like?
Yeah.
No, I was gonna say this feels less like M. Night Shyamalan and more like Scooby, where it's like, there's some hints laying here, and then at the end they pull the mask. It's imperialism. It's racial superiority, right?
Exactly.
It's clearly the culprits lead to their patterns and trends.
And the twist of it is, the Scooby-Doo twist of it is
yeah,
that we live in the Berlin Afterparty now.